All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Demi, and I'm pleased to welcome you all to tonight's event. We have guest author Shawn MacWha here, and we are doing this program in partnership with the Kamloops Society for the Written Arts, and we have JP here representing them. Before we get started, just a couple of reminders. If you miss it when we are live, this program will be accessible on our Facebook page and also on our YouTube channel after the program is done. And also, if you are watching this event live, feel free to type any questions you have into the Facebook comments or also into the chat in Zoom if you're in on Zoom. All right, so without further ado, I will hand things over to JP.
Thank you, Demi, and thank you, Shawn, and welcome. My name is JP. I'm with the Kamloops Society for the Written Arts. I'd like to just first off acknowledge that your hosts today are gathered on the traditional and unceded territory of the Secwepemc people. It's an honor to live, work, and play, as well as laugh, love, and create in Secwepemc. And Kamloops Society for the Written Arts is super happy to partner with the library on bringing cool people to talk about cool ideas. That's sort of how we talk about our author talks. And with the pandemic, it's broadened our audiences, but it's also broadened who we can actually welcome to our little virtual stage here. So I'm super happy that we can bring someone like Shawn from so far away, and that tools like Zoom have collapsed distance, and so we can do this. So I'd like to welcome Shawn. Shawn grew up in Quebec, traveled all around Canada, traveled to over 50 countries, I believe, has some really interesting experiences, is, as we talked about before this, a recovering academic, now lives in Ottawa and has written an absolutely fascinating novel called Eastern Horizons. So we welcome him here today to talk with us about that novel and answer some questions. And I'll hand the stage over to him. It's yours, Shawn. Welcome.
Great, thank you so much. And as you did, I would like to begin my talk by observing the fact that I'm speaking to you right now from Ottawa, which is situated upon the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. It's beautiful country here, as you have beautiful country there, and I want to recognize the fact that we're on their territory as well. I also want to thank everybody for coming together tonight. I know everybody's got many demands on their times, but it's important as a nation and as people, and particularly in this situation, people from very, very far apart, to come together and to share stories. And I think that's very important. And I commend the Thompson-Nicola Regional Library and the Kamloops Society for the Written Arts for assisting in that endeavor, not just with myself, but with everybody. I want to also thank specifically a couple of people who were really instrumental in making this happen. The reason that I'm talking to you from Ottawa, and it's like, why is this guy from Ottawa talking to me, is because in my book, there were a couple of chapters that were situated in and around Kamloops and Merritt. So about a month ago, I called the library and I got this lovely woman, Andre Beauchemin, who heard my story and she put me in touch with somebody else at the library, Catherine Schmidt, and she organized this. And I really want to extend my appreciation to them for that assistance as well. I think, like I said, it's important to support Canadian authors, big and small alike. So tonight's discussion for me is pretty informal. It's kind of almost like a fireside chat. I briefly actually thought about lighting a fire. I have a fireplace just over here. But I just wanted to kind of highlight the way I was going to approach it, and I'm more than happy to accept questions along the way. And if anybody wants to drill down into one of the topics I was going to talk about, I can do that as well. So basically, I was going to cover 6 broad areas of discussion in this, which is a quick overview of the story. I imagine many of you have not read the book yet. So I'll just kind of give you an overview of it without giving you any spoilers, so that you don't get to find out that everybody lives happily ever after, or not, as the case may be. I'll talk a little bit about the main themes that I tried to address, and there are a number of themes that keep coming up in this book and that were important to me to try and express through this creativity. I'll talk about the writing and the editing process as a first-time novelist and a first-time writer, and as we alluded to a little bit at the beginning, about how one at a relatively late age can start to push into the writer's sphere and if not make a living at it, at least have some fun doing it. I'll talk a little bit about the publishing process and some of the options that are available there. And then right on the heels of that, the marketing process. And it's not just a question of getting your book published, but it's a question of getting it out there and doing things like this. And finally, I'm going to do a couple of short readings because, I will say my sales demographics or metrics are pretty good, and I get a sense that there's not a lot of sales coming out of Central British Columbia at this point. Hopefully that'll change in the next couple of days. So I will kind of give you a sense as to what the book sounds like to your ears. As I said, it's an open discussion if you want to chime in. So a little bit about myself, just to pick up from JP, sorry. I was born in a little town called Lachute, which is just outside of Montreal, and I was raised in Lachute and in the Laurentian Mountains, which are lovely mountains on the Quebec side of the Ottawa River. And I was there until about high school, on and off. And then I moved to Ottawa, and then after Ottawa, I spent a lot of time in Calgary in southern Alberta. I have academically, I was a recovering academic. I have a Bachelor of Arts degree in Soviet Studies, to date myself, because there was such a thing when I was studying. I followed that up with a master's degree in military studies at the University of Calgary. And I did start a doctoral program there before I realized that nobody, including myself, really cared about what I was studying. So I stepped away from that. After academia, though, I kind of set out into the world, and over the years, I've lived in Asia for 5 years of my life. I spent 2 years living in Japan, where actually I lived in a little town just outside of Hiroshima, which, as you know, was the site of the first atomic bombing. I actually knew some hibakusha, and hibakusha is the Japanese word for atomic bomb survivors. One of my neighbors was a lovely older woman, who was just the kindest, sweetest person in the world. And when I knew her, and yet when she was 14 years old, somebody dropped an atomic bomb on her, and that was very formative for me in those years. I also spent 3 years living in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur. And a lot of this book, there's a whole sub-theme in this book that is based on Malaysia, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But so Asia is near and dear to my heart, and that's probably why I wrote the book based on events in Asia and how they impact upon Canada. Incidentally, I spent 6 years as an infantryman in the Canadian Reserves when I was much younger. So I did, as I said, 6 years of that, and including 2 years of Sergeant Guard on the Parliament Hill, which was a cool gig when you're a young guy. Lately, I've worked as a national security analyst with the Government of Canada for about the last 22 years. As I said before, kind of writing papers on topics of national security interest. I live in Ottawa now. I've been in Ottawa for the last 10 years. I've got a wife and 4 lovely children, and we're a very happy, close family. At least that's the way I look at it. As I said, in terms of writing, I'm relatively new to writing. I wrote academically a little bit, and we were speaking a little bit before this started. I wrote academically when I was in university, and had a few minor and obscure publications. And when I lived in Japan, I actually edited a local newspaper and had a lot of content in that. But children and work kind of pushed me away from my writing desires. And it was about 3 years ago when I kind of realized one night, I'm like, I'm watching 2 hours of Netflix a night on TV. There just has to be something better. And I had this story that ultimately turned into this novel that had been kicking around in my head for a long time. So I basically turned off the TV and turned on the computer and approached it that way. So in the last 20, 25 years, as JP alluded to, I've traveled a lot. I've been back and forth the country. My last count, I've driven across the country 7 times. All of my children have been to all 10 provinces. None of them have been to the territories, but I did go to the Northwest Territories, and I wish I would have gone to Nunavut and Yukon. I've traveled a lot. I've been to 6 of the 7 continents, spent a lot of time in Asia, as I said, and a lot of time in Europe. A little bit of time in South America and some time in Africa, but not enough time in Africa. I love travel. I love the breadth that it gives you in perspectives, and I love that it can inform our stories and give us perspective on the country that we're so lucky and so blessed to live in. One thing about this writing, though, is it allowed for me to provide a little bit of legitimacy to the book. And as we start talking about some of the places and topics in that, as I was saying at the beginning of the talk before we came online, pretty much everything in this book is real, and you can Google it and you'll find it there. The facts are real. If I'm talking about a weapon system, for example, that's a real weapon system. If I talk about a place, it's a real place. And if you took the time to Google Earth it, you'll actually see that it actually looks the way I've described it to be. a great many of the places mentioned in this book I've been to, some of them on multiple occasions. Some of them I haven't, and I did rely on Google Earth and my own geographical knowledge of the region to inform me on where to look. But I think that the travel and that breadth of travel allowed me to put a little bit more reality into the book. Even though it is a novel, it's a novel grounded in fact. I've said before that if you think back to a book a long time ago, The Hunt for Red October by Tom Clancy, and you got to imagine he wrote that before the internet came online, and that was such a good book, and in the sense that it was all fact. He just took the facts and extrapolated them into a story, and I've kind of tried to do that with this story as well. One thing that I tried to weave into the story too, and as we talk about it, and there'll actually be a reading later on that talks about it. Because of my travel across the country, I've really come to appreciate the healing power of the Canadian landscape, and some of my other writings that I've been starting to get published have really focused on that. And as much as we require the people around us to heal us, we live in this beautiful, beautiful country that offers so much to help us nurse our wounds from day-to-day life, and the wounds that are explored in this book are quite profound wounds. I just wanted to acknowledge a couple of inspirations for coming to write and the way that this book unfolded. And my first inspiration was a woman named Margaret Craven, who wrote an amazing book back in the late 60s called I Heard the Owl Call My Name, situated in British Columbia. And it's about a young vicar who's sent off to live amongst a First Nations community. And the subtext of that is that he has to go there to learn enough to die. The reason I was inspired by her is she was 66 when she wrote that book, and it was her first novel. And I always imagine that it took her 66 years to find what she wanted to say and to say it the way she wanted to say it. And she really didn't do much afterwards. And I was really impressed by that. It was a one-hit home run, and it was a beautiful book if you haven't read it. I was also inspired by Andy Weir, who wrote The Martian that Matt Damon starred in the movie, because he had a job and he liked his job and he made money. He just wanted to tell a story. And we talk a little bit about the editing process, and that I kind of copied a lot of what Andy Weir had done in his approach to marketing and writing his book. But he didn't need to tell a story. He wasn't doing this to make $1 million. He did in the end. He just did it because he wanted to tell a story. So. As I said, this is my first novel, so thank you for giving me your precious time to talk about it. I am kind of an emerging writer, though. I'm now what I would consider probably a regular contributor to Harrowsmith magazine, which is kind of a farming and nature magazine in Canada. I had an article written not too long ago about the craft beer scene in Ottawa, and there's in the winter edition, which is coming out in a couple of weeks, I have an article on how sourdough bread became so popular during the COVID pandemic. I'd seen a meme on Facebook saying that if you take professional sports away from men, you end up with sourdough bread. And I kind of thought that was funny. And then I kind of thought, like, well, I wonder why that is. So I interviewed quite a few bakers and came up with that. And I will have another article coming out with them in the spring edition about sugar bushes in Lanark County, Ontario. I also do some stuff in local newspapers and stuff here in Ottawa. So on to the book, which is why you're here. And I'll give you a quick overview of the book. So Eastern Horizons is about a nuclear war in Asia, and it's set about 10 or 12 years in the future. We don't know specifically. I never put a date on it, but there's hints all through the book as to how we know it's in the future. And it's about a nuclear war between Russia and China. And there is a chapter that explores how it is that these two countries came into conflict. And then it talks about, okay, the nuclear war, the war itself is a pretty short chapter of the book. The rest of the book is about how do we react as a people to the after effects of that war? Because whilst Canada itself was not directly impacted by it, Russia and China were effectively destroyed, and there was profound economic and environmental damage to the world. So at the same time that the war happens, the economy in Canada collapses, the environment collapses, the crops fail, there's not enough food. And then off the coast of British Columbia, refugees begin to arrive, refugees fleeing the situation in Asia, principally Chinese refugees, just given the demographics of the region. And what starts off as a wave turns into a rush, which ultimately ends up in a tsunami. So the key question that Canada is faced with in the story is, at a time when we don't have enough to feed ourselves, when we're facing 20, 30% unemployment. There's political tensions in the country, pulling the country apart from the left and the right. And now we've got 3.5 million refugees showing up on our doorstep. At what point do we, as individuals and as a country, say, yeah, that's enough, we can't take any more? And the subtitle of the book, it's called A Tale of Failure and Redemption. And what we'll see is everybody reaches that point of failure. All the characters in the book reach a point of failure and then spend much of this rest of the story trying to find redemption for that failure. So when you think of it this way, it's like, what's the demographic? Somebody's asked me, well, what's your demographic for a book like this? And when I was looking at publishers, they're like, well, who are we writing this for? And it's like, I don't really know, because I refer to this as a book about social justice that's wrapped in a nuclear war. In some senses, it actually sounds like a Tom Clancy techno thriller thing. And I've been complimented that it reads well in that fact. But ultimately, the point of the story is to kind of evoke that notion of, if you're faced with impossible decisions and there's no real right answer, what would you do? And it directly asks you that, the reader, not in as much as it's not a choose your own adventure, but on the back cover, for example, it says at the very bottom, talking about the main characters, what did they do? What would you do? And if you do read the book, I would challenge you as you're reading it to go, well, if I was in the position of these people, what decisions would I make given the facts that I had before me at the time? So I want to give you a quick kind of reading of it so that you can get a sense of the tone and how it sounds and how it feels. And this part will sound a little Tom Clancy-esque because it sets the crisis, and it's a very short chapter. It's just the opening chapter. And I'll read it to you so you'll get a sense of how it is that we end up in this crisis, and it sets the crisis. So please bear with me while I look down for a moment. So it's chapter 1, and it's called The Desperate. Lieutenant Commander Clara Lewis stood on the deck of His Majesty's Canadian ship Warrior, a Type 26 frigate of the Royal Canadian Navy, and looked down upon the turmoil that spread before her eyes. Along the shoreline of the Yangtze River, thousands of people jostled in a frightened, confused mass of anger and desperation. An overwhelmed company of U.S. Marines tried valiantly to maintain order and to marshal people towards the gangplanks of half a dozen warships, but the threat of anarchy loomed everywhere. In front of her, just upstream, a French destroyer was taking on as many European refugees as it could hold, while behind her, an Australian helicopter carrier, its aircraft dumped into the sea to make more room for people, was almost finished loading 4,000 souls into its hangar deck. Across the water lay the charred, shattered remains of Shanghai, and even though it had been almost a month since the last of the atomic bombs had fallen, the air still smelled of smoke, burning plastic, and death. A young sailor, no more than 19 years old, hesitantly came up and stood beside her without saying anything. Lewis glanced over at him and gave an almost imperceptible nod, grateful for the human company in such an inhuman place. They were silent for a moment, and then without preamble, she began to speak. I was serving on the Summerside, one of the old Kingston-class patrol boats in the Eastern Arctic, about 10 years ago when the peat fire swept across northern Manitoba. We had to get almost 900 people out of Churchill in less than 6 hours, and all we had was a couple of transport planes and our little ship. She paused and wiped away a tear that was rolling down her left cheek. We did it, she said. We got everyone out. We had to put the last 300 people in an old stone fort across the river from town, with a dozen soldiers standing guard against the polar bears. But we got them all out. Every single one of them. And what about now? The young sailor asked. How can we possibly get everyone out of this God-forsaken place? We'll manage, she replied. More ships will come, and we'll get everyone over to Korea or Japan, and we'll sort it out from there. We'll get these people home. She looked out across the writhing, unhappy crowd that stretched back into the maze of narrow streets and warehouses that line the river. We have to get them home. And what about them, the man asked, gesturing into the distance. Once we've saved all the Canadians and all the Americans and all the Europeans and all the other foreigners trapped out there, what will happen to all the Chinese who are left behind? I don't know, she said, slowly shaking her head. I really don't know. I hate this place, the sailor said softly. Me too, Lewis replied. Me too. So that's the crisis. Canadians, and you'll find in the book, the Canadian Navy rushes across the Pacific Ocean to rescue as many foreigners as they can from China after this nuclear war. And there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of Canadians living in Greater China. There's 200,000 Canadians alone in Hong Kong. And in the book being set in the future, I've just extrapolated that to say, I don't know, there are 200,000-300,000 Canadians over there that need to get rescued, not to mention all the Europeans and the Americans and the Brits and the Australians. So after the war, the Navy rushes across the Pacific, and this is where we first meet Clara. And Clara is ultimately the main character of the story. And although there are intersecting storylines, they all kind of revolve around her, and the weight of the book is Clara. And as I wrote this, there are many characters in there, but I don't feel that anything towards the other characters the way I feel towards Clara and another woman in the book named Sophia that you'll meet in a moment. So the main characters in the response to this crisis that I've talked about, there's basically four main characters responding to this crisis. So there is Clara, and Clara is the lieutenant commander in the Canadian Navy, which makes her kind of second in command of a ship. She's from a native of St. Anthony, Newfoundland. Mark Lawrence is kind of her partner in crime, and he's the commander of the ship, and he's from Canmore, Alberta. The other character is Sophia Chen, and Sophia Chen is a Malaysian refugee. I frankly I know a lot more about Malaysia than I know about China, and I didn't feel comfortable writing a Chinese refugee. So as a result of the nuclear war, I created an echo war in Malaysia, what becomes known as the Malaysian Civil War, which displaces about 6 million people in Malaysia. And Sophia Chen gets caught up in this. And she's just an upper middle class person like all of us. She's a dentist in Kuala Lumpur. Her husband's a banker. They've got 2 kids. They go on vacation to Australia. And then ultimately, through no fault of her own, she becomes a refugee, and she's tossed into an impossible situation. And then the final character, so we've got Clara and Mark in the Navy, we've got Sophia, refugee. The final character is Canada, and the Canadian reaction to this crisis. And I tell that story through a bit of a political drama with 3 political parties. They're not named. You can infer there's a small L Liberal Party, there's a small C Conservative Party, and then there's this new party that I've created called the Canada First Party, which is a much more populist, further right party. And these 3 parties are kind of jostling for the soul of the country in the aftermath of the crisis, and how we as a people react to this. One of the reasons I was kind of inspired to write that element of the book is I saw, and as did you, in the last 10 years, the relative difficulty with which Canada accepted 50,000 Syrian refugees after the Syrian Civil War. And whilst many Canadians were very welcoming about it, there were certainly some Canadians who were very vocal in their opposition to that. So I wanted to say, okay, well, if we had difficulty as a nation accepting 50,000 people, how could we possibly accept 3.5 million people at a time when literally there's not enough food to eat, and we're all unemployed, and the economy is in a shambles. So, as I say, in this book, after the crisis, everybody fails at some point after the nuclear war. Mark and Clara fail when they're faced with a trial, and I'm going to read about that in a second. Sophia fails when she's faced with her challenge in Malaysia, and she ultimately fails in her duty to protect her family, or maybe not her duty, but in her desire to protect her family. And Canada fails a little bit in its reaction. I think we'll show, I'll do a little reading about that. And this is kind of the crux of the failure around which everybody fails, except for Sophia. She's a little off to the side on that. And then we'll see how the rest of the novel is about rebuilding and recovering from that failure. A slightly longer reading, but then I'll kind of stop reading about that after a minute. So this is from chapter 7 in the book. And just to set up this book, this chapter is set about 18 months after the nuclear war has happened. And by this point, well over 1 million refugees have come into Canada. And the government has effectively closed the border and ordered the border closed. And at this point, it's recalled the Navy from Asia from rescuing Canadians and Europeans and Americans. And it's called the Navy back to patrol off the west coast, off of Tofino and Ucluelet and that, to stop incoming refugee ships. And it's gotten so bad to the point where the ships are actually ordered to, the warships are actually ordered to fire upon and sink if necessary incoming ships. Now that may sound absolutely incredible, and yet this year, if you go online, you'll see the Greek Navy firing and attempting to sink refugee ships off the coast of Greece. So we see this as happening in European countries. This is not a far off problem in some undeveloped country. This is happening right in our doorstep as we speak now, because the countries are so awash in a problem that they're not sure how to deal with. So what's happened is Lieutenant Commander Lewis and Commander Lawrence have been ordered to sink the ship. And for the last several minutes, they've been on the radio talking to the ship, trying to get the ship to turn around. And the ship is called the MV Helang, and it's a ship. And they've indicated that they have 1,300 refugees on board, and they're seeking to come into Canada. And they've been denied permission to do that. And this is kind of the crux where they get to. So Mark, again, is the commander, so it's ultimately his call to make. Somehow this is the world in which Mark Lawrence now found himself. He was angry at the situation, angry at the orders he had received, angry at the choices that were facing him, and most of all, angry that he was even here in the first place. He should have just stayed in Canmore, he thought, running the quad lift at Panorama or Lake Louise on weekends so that he could afford to ski the same hills during the rest of the week. He knew guys had been doing that since high school. But he was different. He had always felt a sense of duty to protect people weaker than himself. And he had known from a very early age that he was destined to be a police officer, or a firefighter, or a soldier. And here he was now, under a gray sky in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, aiming a cannon at a boatload of defenseless people. It was not supposed to be like this. Lieutenant Commander Lewis roused him from his thoughts. "Sir, he's only a mile from the territorial limit. What do we do?" she asked, seeking perhaps moral as well as military guidance. Lawrence shook his head to clear his thoughts and looked across the water at the Helang. He picked up the radio handset. "Captain of the motor vessel Helang, this is Commander of the HMCS Warrior. I am begging you, please turn around. This is our last chance." He slowly counted to 10 under his breath, praying for a response. None came. He sighed, lifted the handset again, and called down to the operations room one last time. "Nisop, this is Commander Lawrence. I want you to aim the main gun directly at the Helang. I want you to put 10 rounds into it bow to stern along the waterline. That is an order. Do you understand me?" The electronic systems operator acknowledged the command a little too eagerly for Lawrence's liking and began to enter the fire order into the targeting computer. A few members of the bridge crew began to protest, but Commander Lawrence silenced them with a loud bark and a movement of his hand to his holster. At this motion, Lieutenant Commander Lewis reached for her sidearm as well. Lawrence saw this out of the corner of his eye and nodded his appreciation for her support. What he did not know, what he would never know, was that for the briefest of seconds, she had considered drawing her weapon against him before falling back into line with the order. Almost everyone on the bridge had stopped what they were doing and watched the gun's turrets depress slightly and track the Helang. Type 26 frigates are equipped with a 5-inch 54 caliber naval gun. It is extremely effective in an anti-ship capacity against smaller vessels. "Permission to fire, sir?" asked the weapons officer. "Fire," replied the commander in a distant, monotone voice. Over the next 45 seconds, the crew watched in awe as the gun barked, and impact after impact tore open the entire side of the Helang in a series of violent explosions. Almost immediately, the ship began to list to the starboard, and even as its momentum carried it forwards, it turned turtle and capsized in the It turned turtle and capsized. In the distance, they could see fuel burning on the surface of the ocean around the sinking ship, and the frantic splashing of people caught between fire and water, incineration and drowning. No one said anything. The silence seemed to last for a very long time. Finally, Lewis spoke, whispered. "Sir, there are life rafts in the water. What are your orders?" "Call the Ghost Card," he replied. "We're done here. Turn the ship to bearing 320 and proceed at 22 knots. We'll spend the night off San Josef Bay." "They could make it to shore," someone cautioned. "I don't care," the commander answered. "I was ordered to stop the Helang. No one said anything about any life rafts. The Mounties can pick a bump on the beach if they want to." I don't care. So, wow, what kind of a world do we live in where Canada is doing something like that? That's not the Canadian narrative that I think most of us hold in our hearts. But that's where the events of the book, and again, this took place in chapter 7. So, a little bit of lead up that got us to the point where we actually find ourselves in that situation where Mark, who is portrayed early in the book, is a moral guy. He's got a wife and 3 kids, and he's just a guy doing his job. He wants to protect people, and he finds himself in a situation like that. And as we see in the book, he's only got a couple of seconds to make up his mind. He doesn't have a lot of time to make a decision. And because of some of the context that's gone on, he doesn't know what the right decision to make is. And that's his failure and Clara's failure, because you can see Clara there. She's not quite sure. She almost draws her gun against him. She almost commits mutiny to stop him from doing that. But then she falls into order. And then, so she fails in a way, and that comes back to haunt her. And then ultimately Canada, that put these 2 people in this situation in the first place, has kind of failed in a way too. Incidentally, it's in that chapter, or right after that chapter, that Kamloops and Merritt come into it, because I mentioned the millions of refugees that are coming into Canada. And ultimately the government opts to put them in along the Highway 5I corridor between Merritt and Kamloops, in that valley between Nicola Lake and Stump Lake and things like that. So that's kind of how it is that I'm talking to you in Canmore, in Kamloops. So we talked about Sophia Chen, and she's the refugee, and I wanted to capture that. I knew all along that I wanted to write a female lead for that. I have worked with refugee communities both in Canada and in Asia, and trust me, you do not want to be a female refugee. It's not a good place to be, and I wanted to make sure that we captured that for Sophia to highlight some of the trauma that she faces. So ultimately, as I said, the book asks you to consider, what would you do if you were put in those positions, and if you had to make decisions about limiting the number of people who are coming to you for help at a time when you didn't have it. And it's easy right now in Canada to say, oh yeah, we got lots of money, there's unemployment is there, but generally there's not a lot of countries in the world that have it as well off as we do. So maybe we can take in X number of people. Question becomes, how large does that X become? And how does that happen when our resources ourselves are declining? I will point out too, this is an unabashedly Canadian novel. It's about Canadians. It's set, even though there's a nuclear war in Asia, and a fair amount of the book is set in Asia, it all rotates around Canada. And it's a Canadian warship, and it's a Canadian officer and things like that. And it's Sophia coming to Canada in the end. And it's ultimately, a lot of people have told me since I've published this book, have come out and said, you would have made a lot more money if you wrote this as an American book and sold this as an American idea. And I said to people all along on that, I have a job. I'm not writing this to make $1 million. Of course, I would love to make $1 million, but that's not a realistic thing. I'm writing it because I have a story to tell, and I want to tell a Canadian story. So if you're looking for a book that's about Canada and about Canadians, and I've had people describe this, because at one point, Clara leaves Victoria, where she's based, and goes back to St. Anthony to go see her father, and she drives across the country, and there's little pit stops in the book all across the country as she kind of finds herself on that journey and goes back to Newfoundland to find that. So in this story, I've tried to address a number of major themes, one is the limit of our individual and collective compassion. I've hinted at that, right? It's easy to be compassionate when it doesn't cost you anything. When it does cost you something, what's our individual, as the reader, what's your limit? Do we say, and I say at the back, what's the limit for Canada? Is it 1 million? Is it 5 million? Is it 10 million? And this is a realistic question. There's 3 billion people out there in the world that would love to come to Canada right now. And we as a society said, no, we're not going to do that. But we've also said as a society, well, we're going to allow 300,000 people in a year. So at the national level, that's a decision we've made. As an individual level, what do we do? What should Clara had done there, given the totality of the story around her? The other key issue that I want to address is our capacity to forgive ourselves, individually and as a nation, if we fail, because this is a book about failure, and it's a book about trying to find the strength and the perspective and the wisdom to forgive ourselves for our failings. So that's another key thing that I talk about. Another thing that I try to address in this, and there's basically 5 key themes that I'm trying to address in that, is the impacts of PTSD upon our military veterans. We ask a lot of our military, and I have a lot of friends in the military, and I've worked closely with the military over the years. And as I said at the beginning, I was in the military many years ago. You can imagine someone like Mark being put in a position like that. I don't think a lot of us have the programming to do something like that. And I can't imagine any of us have the programming to do something like that and not be affected by it. And we have in our midst right now thousands and thousands of Canadians who were off in Afghanistan and saw combat and are carrying around the emotional and psychological scars of that as much as any physical scars. So I wanted to highlight that and say, like, we ask a lot of our soldiers, and we should be mindful of that when we do so. I also wanted to address as a 4th topic kind of the role of the refugee in the Canadian psyche. We acknowledged, both of us at the beginning of this, that we're all sitting here on unceded traditional territory of the First Nations, who are by definition here first. And I would imagine that a great many of us are refugees or descendants of refugees. And I look at my family genealogy as one of my hobbies. And on my maternal side, my maternal people were United Empire Loyalists, and they were absolutely refugees from the American Revolution. My 6th great grandfather was beaten to death on his farm outside of New York City by Americans after the war because he had supported the Brits. And as a result of that, their whole family had fled north and ended up in Kingston, Ontario. And on my paternal side, we're all potato famine refugees from Ireland. So we are a nation of immigrants and refugees. And I think 100 years ago, the distinction was probably not as clear as it is today. So a lot of the people who came and settled this country and made it what it is came because it's a better place to be. And the last thing, which I hinted at, is I wanted to talk about the healing power of the Canadian landscape. So throughout the book, those are the 5 things I'm trying to address. And anybody who has read the book, I'm happy to take questions on the degree to which I did or didn't meet that. But if you do embark on reading this book, and I believe it's a quick and easy, it's a demanding read. I think if you read it closely, there's a lot of questions that are asked of you. But I think I'm biased, but I think it's a quick, easy, and pleasant read. And that's the feedback I've gotten from several hundred people now at this point have read the book and have told me that this is what they found on it. So I think at that, without giving away too many spoilers, I'm not going to tell you that much more about the book itself. I was going to go on and talk about the writing process a little bit because, this is the Kamloops Society for the Written Arts, and I can imagine there are some writers out there, and I want to share with you kind of how I approached this book and writing about it. So I mentioned living in Asia. This idea, and I mentioned before, kind of stepping away from the TV to write this, actually came to me. The idea for this book came to me on a flight from Singapore to Jakarta. And I was flying down, it was about 10, 12 years ago, Jakarta, Indonesia. And the pollution over in Asia can be quite horrific at times. And certainly there are many, maybe even most times when you're flying intercity, you can't see the ground because the pollution is so bad. And at the time, as I was sitting there, probably nursing a malt, looking out the window, it kind of struck me. I'm like, well, what would happen if the pollution got so bad that it started to create climate refugees, and they just had to flee this pollution? Because I know we're all walking around wearing masks right now, but 12 years ago when I was living in Malaysia, we were wearing masks against the pollution. And I have distinct memories of playing golf on a tropical golf course wearing a mask and thinking, wow, this is really weird. This is like Blade Runner. It's such a strange place to be. So that was the initial idea for it. And I pretty much wrote chapter 7, which is that chapter that I just read from, where the Canadian warship is sinking a refugee ship, all on that flight. And by the time I landed in Jakarta, I kind of had it roughed down. But then 10 years came and went, and I have 4 lovely children, and we played together a lot, and I just didn't write the book. Incidentally, the ship, which is now named the HMCS Warrior, I had originally named the HMCS Lethbridge. I don't really know why I changed that, because I like Lethbridge, but I think Warrior is just, the idea is for a while, the way the chapters were organized is the ship was called the Warrior, but I also had Mark Lawrence kind of as the Warrior. So there was a bit of a double entendre between the ship and the officer. When I wanted to write this book, though, as I said, I wanted to create this refugee crisis. and 10 years ago, it was kind of a climate refugees. But in the intervening 10 years, climate fiction's kind of emerged as a genre, and there's been a lot of work done on climate fiction. And I know even just a couple of weeks ago, one of your guest speakers here, Jeff Strong, wrote a book about the climate impact and how that created problems in Kamloops and in Merritt, the same area I've kind of covered. So I didn't want to do climate, and because of my academic background, I kind of knew more about military anyway. So I kind of said, well, what I need to do is create a crisis big enough to move millions of people across the Pacific Ocean as refugees. And realistically, what could do that? I could write science fiction, have an alien invasion. In hindsight, I could have written a pandemic, and that would have been prescient, but I didn't. So I ended up saying, well, a nuclear war would do it. And I think it's important too, because we often forget, and a lot of us grew up in the Cold War, kind of living under that nuclear umbrella, but a lot of younger people didn't. And we forget that there's still 14,000 nuclear weapons out there. There's still almost 4,000 deployed nuclear weapons out there that are ready to be fired tonight. So if you look at the nuclear arsenals of Russia and China, you've got 6,500 nuclear weapons in Russia and a relatively modest 320 weapons in China. So I wanted to remind the reader too that it's like, look, in the last 10 years, we've spent a lot of time talking about climate change as an existential threat, and I wouldn't denigrate that at all. Of course, it's a threat, but let's not forget the large stockpile of nuclear weapons that are still out there. So in the book, as this war happens, there's an exchange, and ultimately I think 516 nuclear bombs go off. So as I say, it doesn't kill the planet, but it certainly causes a lot of damage. And if anybody out there is a history buff, and I won't give you the answer to this, there is an Easter egg. 516 is a number in Canadian history, and Canadian military history, that if you want to find out why 516 is a number. All through the book, I kind of leave those little Easter eggs for people to find if they're looking for them. So I started writing this book, and I had a good rough draft of chapter 7, so I pulled that out, and for the longest time I tried to keep chapter 7 as the front of the book, and ultimately I couldn't. I couldn't make the timeline work in any logical way. So it was well into the writing process, probably a year into the writing process, where I finally had to back down and rearrange the chapters. And ironically enough, chapter 1, the first chapter I read to you, was the first chapter that I wrote. I wrote pretty much every day because of my kids. I spent a lot of time with the kids. They would go to bed. My oldest is 16, so around 10 o'clock. And then I would write from 10 o'clock till midnight, or 10 o'clock until 1 o'clock in the morning. And that's largely when the book got written. And then on the way to work the next day, I would think about what I wrote and kind of proofread it in my head and correct it in my head, go back the next night and revisit it. I gotta say, I loved it. I loved every part of the writing process. I know some authors are like, oh, I hated the editing, or I hated writing this, or I loved it all. It was such a joy to write the book. And anybody out there who wants to write, I wish you that blessing of really enjoying your craft and enjoying your art, because it's not at all a chore. There was never a day where I came in. There were certainly times where I had writer's block and I couldn't proceed, and I would have to step back for a week or two and just let things sit. But even when that happened, I would still be churning away on it. So it was a lovely process. I love the editing process. I kind of equate editing to like taking an apple and just polishing it until you can get it as shiny as you can. Or the other illusion I have is a crumpled up piece of paper, and then you try and flatten it out as flat as you can. And to me, that's the editing process. And, you know, I suspect there's probably still typos in there. I will confess I didn't hire an editor because this was an act of just joy for me. And so I've set it off into the world. But actually, I think I got them all. I had a lot of people read it. As I was doing this, I wanted to validate whether or not this was even a good idea or a good story, or if I was just completely delusional that this was a good story. So I mentioned before Andy Weir. He did a really cool podcast. There's an amazing organization called the Long Now Foundation out of California, and they do kind of future thinking. And they have a podcast, just the Long Now Foundation, I think. And back in 2015, Andy Weir, who'd written The Martian, gave a nice talk on how it came to write that book. And he told his story. I kind of copied his blueprint. And one of the things he had done is he just posted some chapters online, kind of in an online forum, to see if people would like them, and also could kind of crowdsource corrections to his science in that. So I put the first 3 chapters of my book kind of 1 month at a time out on a WordPress, really basic website for people to read. And I think probably overall I had about 300 people come back and say, yeah, it's a cool story, I want more. So, and some good feedback about what wasn't working and stuff like that. The other thing that was really important, I think, in the editing process and the writing process was having trusted beta readers. And I can't stress that enough. And a beta reader is someone who'll take a rough draft and go over it. And this has to be someone you trust, and someone who's not just going to be like, oh, yeah, it's great, I love it, right? I had one friend of mine, former military officer, high-ranking military officer, who read it. And he was just stellar. He went through this line by line by line. He found comma splices, and he found entire chapters. He goes, I don't see how this chapter is helping your story at all. And I really appreciated his honesty, and I owe great debt to him for that. I hope he's listening. If he is, he knows who he is. But there were many other writers who did the same thing for me, and friends and writers, and I tried to get different people to do that. And then I've read this book so many times, like thousands of times. I'd read it line by line, and actually I still pull it out and read it every once in a while too. A couple of surprises in the writing thing was the fact that somehow, and I didn't really set out to do it, both my lead characters ended up being women. And I'm not sure how Claire ended up being a woman, but it was pretty clear on in the beginning that she needed to be. And as I said before, Clara needed to be. I care deeply about these characters, and my wife was great. My wife kind of helped me keep them real. And every time I would go back to her and say, can I write this? Is this the way I should be saying this as a female character? And you know, so, and I'm lucky I have a teenage daughter who was very honest in her feedback. And they helped me to kind of keep that, those characters honest. So if anybody reads it and has opinions about that, I'm happy to hear them. I have a website, and you can leave a note there. As I said, chapter 7 not being there. The other thing that was a surprise to me is how much I really, really enjoyed. Every chapter in this book begins with a short quotation from other literature and stuff like that. And I had so much fun finding those quotations. And some of them were easy because I'd read them, and some of them I had to look for them because I was looking for somebody to say something that would resonate with me. But that was probably, I would say, the funnest part of writing the book was finding those quotations, and I'm really proud of each one of them. I will share with you kind of my favorite 2 of them, or favorite 3 of them that I have. So on chapter 15, and it's just a header, kind of like, you know, when you open up the chapter, pardon me, like here, kind of there's the thing, and there's this little quotation here. Chapter 15 is a quotation from Ernest Hemingway in A Farewell to Arms, and it says, "The world breaks everyone, and afterwards, many are strong in the broken places." And the title of that chapter is called The Broken, and it's about Sophia and how Sophia is broken from things that had happened to her. Another quotation, like chapter 9, also about Sophia, is a quotation from Eric Maria Remarque, who wrote a beautiful book called All Quiet on the Western Front about the effect of trench warfare in World War I. And I particularly like this book because it was my grandfather's book, and my grandfather served in World War I in Europe. So there's a little family history to that book, and it's always been a near and dear book to me. So I pulled a quotation out of that. And again, it's about Sophia and her hard times. And the line says, "We are little flames, poorly sheltered by frail walls against the storm of dissolution and madness, in which we flicker and sometimes almost go out." But absolutely my favorite quotation from this is a simple quotation, and this is ultimately the core of the book, and this is what the book is ultimately about, and that's why I call it a book about social justice wrapped in nuclear war. And it's a quotation by Mahatma Gandhi, and it's very simple. He says, "The enemy is fear. We think it is hate, but it is fear." And that's ultimately the crisis that we face in this book. I want to leave some time for some questions. I'm going to speed up a little bit, talk a little bit about publishing and marketing. Anybody in Canada who wants to publish a book, there's a lot of different ways to do it. You can go the traditional publishing route, and I kind of looked at that, but I decided pretty quickly I wasn't going to do that. And part of that was informed by the Andy Weir podcast I'd listened to, and how he had been very successful in not initially going down that path. Part of it was the fact that, you know, I didn't really expect to become Margaret Atwood out of this or anything like that. I didn't think I was going to sell 1 million copies or anything like that. I just wanted to tell my story and put it out there. So I had kind of decided pretty early on, I was just going to self-publish this on Amazon. There are some vanity publishers, for lack of a better term, that will basically publish anything for you, but they will charge quite a lot of money for it. So I did check with a couple of traditional publishers, and they said, look, it's going to take us 2 years to even look at this book before we decide whether we're going to publish or not. And I said, I'm not going to wait 2 years to tell my story. My story is told and it's written, and it's the story I wanted to tell. So I'm just going to share it. I wasn't going to go with a vanity publisher, not because there's anything wrong with it. There isn't. And my brother actually recently published a book kind of in a similar vein, and it's a lovely story. But what I wanted to do was these guys will charge a lot of money to do what ultimately Amazon does for free, which is get you an ISBN and get you a barcode and get you global distribution and get you an ebook and a print book and all this. So this book is available in print format and in electronic format. And the beauty of it is it's all print on demand. There's a printer down in Ohio, I believe, and if you press an order for it tonight, the printer goes and one copy comes out and it gets put in the mail. Nowhere is there a warehouse full of hundreds and hundreds of books that won't get sold. Well, hopefully they do get sold. So I know that I know that some people look at Amazon as this big bad corporate world. I kind of look at it the other way. It's a chance for small craft artisans to share their wares globally, and that's the way I looked at it, and I was very grateful. I found it was an easy way to do it, and I would recommend it again. Either way, you publish a book, though, nobody's going to sell it for you. You have to sell it yourself, and you have to market it. If I just put it on Amazon, I'd sell 1 or 2 copies a month probably. It's like nobody's looking for my name. Nobody's looking for a book about a nuclear war between Russia and China yet. So there is a lot of marketing to it, and I kind of have the sense you have to do that pretty much, unless you're a very famous author. You have to push it. So I gotta say I really enjoyed the writing process, and I'm enjoying the marketing process as well. And I've had a couple of things that I've done that have been relatively worked for me, which is as with tonight, I called the local libraries of all the towns that were mentioned in the book, and I said, hey, I wrote a book about your town. I'd love to send you a free copy. And incidentally, I believe the Thompson-Nicola, I know they have a copy. I believe they were going to put it in a collection. And I did that with all the towns that were mentioned in it. So that's kind of a way of getting the book out in a place where people can see it. And I'm hoping a library at some point will, somebody will walk into the branch and say like, hey, look, here's a book about our town. I called local newspapers in those same cities, and I was lucky. I was surprised. Newspapers are often fairly hungry for content, so I had newspapers who were quite willing to come out and interview me and do write-ups and stuff like that. Nothing big, not the National Post or anything like that, but there's a couple of newspapers here around Ottawa and in Eastern Ontario were very kind to me that way. Obviously, I work my social networks and Facebook and stuff like that. I have sent out free copies to certain people that I would think of as influencers, either media influencers. For example, I sent a copy to my member of Parliament, and she said she liked it. I don't know if she read it, but she was very grateful for it. I also went to local businesses, and some local businesses were happy to sell it at point of sale. I would just kind of say, look, this is the profit. I'll split the profit with you. I do find that I did do some Facebook ads, and they had no measurable impact to me on my sales. So I'm not sure if I'm going to go down that path at all anymore or not. So anybody out there has ideas, I'm happy to hear your ideas about that. So I think I'm going to open it up for questions in a little bit. I want to give one more quick reading though. And this is about when we talked about PTSD and the effects of things. And this actually follows right after the sinking of the Helang when Mark did it. And as I mentioned, Clara is kind of the primary character in the story. And this picks up with Clara. And to set it up, she left the Navy after that happened. And she's decided she needs to go home. And she wants to go home to see her father. And one thing you'll find in the book as you read through it, all the characters are named. I've never named the father. There's no name to the father. It's always just Clara's father, or he, Clara's father. And I did that on purpose because when you read the book, you'll find he's the person amongst all the chaos and all the wrong that's going on in the world. He's the person that we want to be, that we aspire to be. And he's certainly the father that I aspire to be. So Clara's gone home to see her father in St. Anthony. And if you haven't been to St. Anthony, go. It's the most beautiful, beautiful place in the world. It's just jaw-dropping. So this is a pretty short reading, but to me, it just kind of highlights when I was talking about the healing power of Canada and the landscape. I'll actually read the quotation at the front just because I was doing that before. It's called Chapter 8, The Survivor. And the quotation is from John Steinbeck, The Winter of Our Discontent. It is so much darker when a light goes out than it would have been if it had never shone. And this is the start of the chapter. Clara Lewis, she was not a lieutenant commander anymore, sat on the rocks overlooking Partridge Cove and watched the icebergs stuck in St. Anthony Bight. It was a beautiful July day, and the sky was so clear, so crystal, that if you tapped it with a hammer, it would have shattered into 1,000 pieces and rained into the sea. There hadn't been many days like this since the war, but today was like the days of her youth, the days when the lines on the horizon were as sharp as razors, and she had wept sometimes at the beauty of it all. She had come here often during the past few months, walking over the hill past Cemetery Road from the town of St. Anthony on the northern tip of Newfoundland. She came to watch the changing colors, and perhaps to punish herself with the cold Arctic winds. She came here to heal and to find what was left of her soul and bring it whatever comfort she could. She came here because she had nowhere else to go, and so, like a frightened child, she just came home. It had been a very long road from Victoria to St. Anthony. So I think with that, I'm going to kind of close it up. A couple of plugs. I think from my perspective, as I said, I loved writing this book. And if you have a story that you want to tell, I would just so much encourage you to tell your story and put it out there into the world and let it land where it lands. I don't think there's very many writers in Canada that are going to make a living off writing or a good living off writing. I could sell 1,000 copies. I could sell 100,000 copies of my book. I still need to have my job. There's just not enough money in it. So it's not, and I think if anyone's going into it to get rich or to something like that, I'm not sure that's going to work. But I think if you want to add to the national narrative and just have your voice into that song that is all of us, then I would encourage you to do that. And if you sell 10 copies, you sell 10 copies. If you give away 100 copies, your story's out there. So I think at that point, shameless plug, it is available on Amazon. It's $13.99 for a print copy, and it's $3.99 for an electronic copy, an ebook. The print copy is shipped pretty quick. I actually find it to be a pretty, and it's a well-done book. I will give a couple of plugs too. I've mentioned my son a couple of times. He actually did the cover design and the layout on this book and put it all together for me. I handed him a Word document and he produced this, so I will appreciate him for that. And the photographs on it, this is kind of my last plug. It's actually a bookend. The name of the book, Eastern Horizons, is a bit of a double entendre because the front picture is a picture of a beach in Malaysia where Sophia is a refugee. And this is a beach that I used to go to all the time on the East Coast. So it's a play on the Far East, the Orient, and the eastern coast of Malaysia. And on the back cover, there's a picture of the icebergs in St. Anthony. So the eastern coast of Canada. So it's the eastern horizon of Asia and the eastern horizon of Canada. And of course, horizon, if you look up in a dictionary, it's a line beyond which we can't see. And that's ultimately what the crisis is it takes us to this point where we can no longer see beyond what we need to do. So if I would love it, I would really appreciate it if you bought a copy. And if you did, I would also appreciate it if you could review it on Facebook or Goodreads. But if you don't, I appreciate your time and I really enjoy the opportunity to speak with everybody who's listening tonight. And with that, JP, if you got any questions or.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I just give you some applause here. That was fantastic. And I know that it's very strange to present to a few squares on a computer screen.
Indeed.
And you can't look at people in the eyeballs and get some of that immediate feedback and read the warmth. But I will tell you that, from my perspective, you said you were aiming for a fireside chat, and it really felt and sounded like that to me. And so I thank you for that, for setting that tone. And I find the quality of your voice lends itself to this kind of thing very well too, I will say. So it's a joy to listen to. And I'm
used to getting no response when I talk because I have 4 children.
It's an odd sort of environment. So I'll start us off with a couple of questions, if you don't mind. You talked about the healing power of the Canadian landscape. And the book addresses questions about compassion, as you said, individual and collective. What's the relationship between travel and compassion. You've traveled a lot. You've written a book that addresses the idea of compassion. Can you comment on that? Any relationship between travel and compassion?
You know, that's a really, really interesting question. And it's one that I've struggled with a lot over the years because, you know, on one respect, travel opens your eyes and it shows you, um, again, how wonderfully well off we are here. And I'll tell you a story where I was in a little town in Indonesia on the island of Java, which is probably the most densely populated island in the world. And I was sitting with my family, and at the time I had two young children, like a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, and this gentleman had come up, and they're just incredibly poor, and as a result of it, you're very often accosted for money and for help, and this gentleman came up, and we were eating at a restaurant, and he asked for, you know, I didn't understand what he was saying, but he was that, and I said to him very tersely, and this was kind of my low point as a human being, I just said, like, leave me alone, like, bug off. And there was a fried egg that my son had ordered that he didn't want to eat, and he'd taken a bite of it and didn't eat it. And I'm ashamed to say this. I very flippantly said to the guy, "Look, if you're that hungry, take the egg." And the guy took the egg and he dropped it, and it fell onto this muddy floor full of God knows what. And he picked it up and he ate it. And it was like someone slapped me in the face. I'm like, this poor man was hungry, and I was a jerk to him, and I will forever owe that man a debt of an apology. And this is my public apology to him. But I've told this story many times because that's what travel shows you. Travel shows you that there's billions of people out there that are really, really not doing well, and there's billions of people out there living on a couple of dollars a day.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that forces you to either become very calloused or very compassionate. And again, I said to that, well, even that, what do we do? Do I give my entire income to UNICEF as an individual? Does Canada let in all of these people? We obviously make a call about what we do. And in one part in the book, there's actually, it calls out the small L liberal a little bit too, because the right-wing guy, the populist guy, he's very honest. He's a bit of a jerk maybe, but he's honest. He goes, I know exactly how many refugees we should let into Canada, and that number is 0. And, you know, like he's not unclear about what he wants. Whereas the rest of the country is kind of like, well, is it 1 million? Is it 5 million? Is it 10 million? Do we make Chinese an official language? What do we do? So there's a bit of a, you know, he's not hypocritical at all, whereas in the smaller liberal world is a little bit hypocritical because we do put limits on it. We do know, walking away from it, that that guy's still out there and he's still hungry, and you know, I don't have an answer for that. That's a long answer, but I think it makes you that. On the flip side, though, as we go through all of these social examinations right now about our past, and we are rightly critical about what we did as a society in the past, I have to wonder what our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren are going to say. Like, you guys knew about climate change and you still flew down to Cuba every summer or every winter? Like, I have trouble reconciling that, guys. And you know, so I'm mindful of that. And even when I was living in Asia, and I was flying around Asia a lot, and this was 10, 12 years ago, I was like, man, I have a huge carbon footprint, and I'm not really sure I'm doing the world any good by flying around the world in circles here. So compassion is a complex, broad spectrum issue, right? And all I can say is, as individuals and as a country, we have to do our best. And if our best isn't that good, then we have to forgive ourselves and move on.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And I heard someone say that this pandemic is nature's way of sending us to our room to think about what we've done, right? You know.
There was a writer on Medium, which is a cool American website, and he called it The Great Pause. And I forget, this was like back in April. It was a really good article.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to think about it. You know, you said that it's a very Canadian book. It's a book about Canada and about Canadians, and something, they're very Canadian themes. Compassion is a very Canadian theme, or at least it's a part of what we see as what you call the Canadian narrative. What do you think of the traditional Canadian narrative? Not necessarily that the book is a criticism, a critique of the traditional Canadian narrative. It sounds more like a moral thought experiment in some ways. But what is the Canadian narrative traditional? Does it need rethinking, or what do you think of it?
That's a good question. I'm fiercely proud of Canada. I've spent most of my adult life defending it in one capacity or the other. It's a country with with sins for which it must atone, and certainly our treatment of the First Nations for the last 400 or 500 years, is something that I just don't have a solution to that, but I want to have a solution to it, and I'll do my part as a citizen to atone for that and to move us collectively forwards. But I think the same is true. We have all these all throughout history, right? I mentioned, being an Irish refugee, my great grandparents, and there was all sorts of racism against the Irish, and that's not to equate it and say one's worse than not, but if we go digging through the past, we're going to find all sorts of bad things. I think, though, when I look around, I see a country that works. I see a country where 1 in 5 citizens was not born here, and yet they come here. And I was talking to a guy not too long ago, and he was originally from a country in Africa and grew up in public housing, and now he's like, he owns 2 houses, and he's a great guy, and like he came here, and he would have been that poor guy with the egg, and instead he's a member of society. So I think it's good that we do that self-criticism and that self-evaluation, but I think that, we don't need to hate ourselves. We've done a good thing here, and we've done a good thing that 90% of the world doesn't have. So, we should take that pause to say, like, look, we're just people doing our best here, and we're trying to be respectful to each other, and we're trying to acknowledge each other's weaknesses and each other's strengths. So I think that's the Canadian, and I think that is the Canadian narrative. I think the Canadian narrative is that, I said I grew up in Quebec, and, I spent a lot of time out in Alberta. So language politics, I know in Western Canada is really, has a different flavor than it does in Central Canada. But I think as Canadians, we ultimately owe a great debt to the fact that this is a country with 2 nations, or arguably, many nations, but in its founding sense, because I think that what it taught us to do from our point of birth, it actually talks about that. There's a part of the book where it says that we were forced at the point of our birth to learn to be conciliatory to one another, to make amends for the French and the English. And it's in our DNA to accept the fact that you're different, but you're one of us. And, if you look at American history and what's going on in the United States right now, I'm not sure that lesson is the same there. So I think that that's part of it. And now, fortunately, after 400 years, we're starting to extend that narrative to other parts of our national fabric, to say, okay, you're part of us, and okay, if I need to speak French to you for you to make you feel included, then I'll be happy to do that. And if you would like for me to acknowledge that I'm living on unceded territory, then of course I would do that. Like, why wouldn't you? So I don't know. I think we just need to keep being decent to each other.
And I know those are big sort of philosophical questions. I want to touch on one thing in terms of, thank you for talking about the writing process and all of that, because it is helpful. And we do get a lot of our audience are writers, either emerging or established. And we get good engagement from quite a cross section of writers. But one of the things that struck me is your openness to feedback. And that can be a challenge for emerging writers, to put yourself out there, to ask people to read it, to take their advice. How do you get over resistance to that? And it's partly an ego thing, or partly a self-protection kind of thing. How do you be an open person when you're getting feedback? Is there a trick?
You got to check your ego at the door, right? If it's a creative process, right? And you look at a painting on a wall, and some people are going to like it, and some people aren't going to like it. And if you read my book and you say, this is tripe, I don't like this at all, right? It's like, there's a great expression in French, chacun son goût, to each his own taste. It's the same thing, right? So I can't please everybody, and maybe people would be offended by this book. I don't know why, but I'm sure there's enough people out there. Somebody's going to be bound and determined to be offended by it. But you tell your story honestly, and you tell your story. I spent a lot of time on this, and this is 100% without variance the story that I wanted to tell. And if I had friends and colleagues and distant associates who came in and said, this is distracting from your core message, then I think you need to just take your ego and say, okay, that's good feedback. And of course, there were points where people said you should change it. So I'm like, no, I'm not. Like, it's my story. and I mentioned Easter eggs, right? Because it's my story. There's all sorts of things in there that I care about that I put in the book. Like, there's a political conference in Lachute because, wow, it's my hometown. Why can't I write my hometown into the book? And, Lachute's this little, no offense, nothing town of 10, 12,000 people, probably a struggling economy, too far away from Montreal to be a bedroom community, but too small to be a center of anything. So it's, so I'm like, yeah, give Lachute a plug. It's a great place. I was there this weekend and love.
Yeah, that's great. And how do you find beta readers? Like you mentioned that, you mentioned one person that, a military officer that you trusted and gave you honest feedback. How do you choose good beta readers? Is there a way to go out and find them, or is it just finding people in your circle you trust?
I think it's a combination of that. I had a good friend of mine who's a professor at a university read over it. I had quite a few of them. I tried to go for kind of I wanted to hit the demographic I was aiming for. I don't really see teenagers reading this book, although we had some friends over a couple of weeks ago in the backyard, and they pointed out their 13-year-old read it and loved it. So I was kind of happy to hear that a 13-year-old could read it and love it, because it's definitely adult themes here. There is a nuclear war, millions of people die. But it's not graphic, and I will say that there's no point in there that I wouldn't not want my 13-year-old to read it. She can read it, and I'm not sure she'd get it, but there's nothing in there that's going to scandalize a teenager. But I was aiming at kind of probably people in our demographic, or in the 30, 40, 50, 60, 70-year-old thing, people who understood maybe what the Cold War was about and understood, had a little bit of mileage on their tires. Mm-hmm. So, by coincidence, that's my social circle anyway. So I found people, and I found people that would be very willing to be honest, because I had some beta readers came back and, they read it in a weekend and they're like, hey, it's great. And I'd look in and there's like one comma that they added in or something. And I'm like, okay, I appreciate that. But I'm looking for criticism here, not praise. Now I'm looking for praise.
Yeah, of course. So, another thing that seems that in this day and age, you talked about how you turned off Netflix and decided to write a book, which I think feels a little bit like a revolutionary act. And then in the age of Twitter too, when everything is compacted and writing a novel seems like a pretty bold thing to do. How do you turn off Netflix and write a novel? How do you compete? Why not write a screenplay? Why not write what is it about the novel?
You're right. I think it is a bit of a revolutionary act, because I think I don't want to sound like this old guy. Society's getting dumb, because I think people have been saying that for hundreds of years. But I think that there should still be scope for serious discussion about serious issues. And I think in your preamble, you said, interesting people talking about interesting things, right? And there's a lot going on out there. And I think right now we're fixated on one issue, rightly or wrongly. We're fixated on this COVID crisis, right? But climate change is still out there, and exploitation of miners is still out there. And the dolphins are still eating plastic, and all these things that we kind of forgot about. And I think that it's incumbent upon us to look at the forest and not a tree. And that's not to say anything. And I think that was my act of that, is saying, like, for one guy living in Ottawa, I have a message that, hopefully, maybe 100 people read, hopefully 1,000 people read, great if 1 million people read it. But it's, what I realized in writing the book is there's certain things I can control for and certain things I can't. I can control whether I have the discipline to write it. I can control whether or not I have the ego flexibility to have people criticize it. And I can control whether I put it out into the universe. Mm-hmm. At that point, I've lost control. I can't control if people read it. I can't control if people like it. I don't even worry about it. I want people to, because I think it's an important lesson for us to say, be compassionate. And if you mess up and you're not compassionate, forgive yourself. Mm-hmm. And I think I think compassion is what we need. That's the glue that holds us together. And that goes back to the national narrative, right? Mm-hmm. We see, and I don't want to pick on our neighbors. We see, you can go to Europe and you see all these little petty politicians that are just spewing hate for their own little political gain and stuff like that. And my message in this book is, come on, Canada, we're better than that, Canada. Like, we can shine here and be that.
That's great. And I think that, the novel is the perfect form to explore morally ambiguous or tough questions, right? Like, and we can't do it in other forms in the same way as we can with the novel. So it sounds like the perfect vehicle for your particular concern there.
I do think, and if there's any film producers out there, I actually think it would make a good movie, because of there are some action sequences, and that there's a lot of character development in the book. Like, I haven't sent it to an agent or anything like that. Maybe I will, but I'm still balancing work and life and all that. So, it's at this point, it's kind of a hobby. I've always said, if I'll even sell the book, and you can make it American if you guys want to make a movie out of it. But I look back at some of the film producers like Paul Gross and Alan Hocko, who really did a good job in portraying Canadian stories. And I think, to go musically, we all loved The Hip, because The Hip didn't sell out, right? The Hip stayed Canadian. And Alan Hocko and that amazing movie Hyena Road that he and Paul Gross produced, and I'm sure there were others, and no disrespect to them, or Passchendaele. These are Canadian stories, and we live beside this behemoth, so we naturally feel insecure. But we're a country of almost 40 million people. We should have the strength to tell our stories on a global scale and say, this is a Canadian novel, this is a Canadian movie, and we shouldn't be shy about that.
It's amazing, and thank you. I mean, I'll say for everyone, on behalf of everyone, thank you for doing it. Thank you for putting the time in and writing stories. As writers, sometimes it's hard to find the license. I guess we need someone. We had a writer named Ian Weir talk about finding the license, and you need someone in your life to say that is a valuable way to spend your time. And often as writers, we have to try and give that to ourselves. That's even a struggle. So thank you for being able to do that. And we're going to send out, the link to your book to our entire mailing list as a follow-up promotion for this. Encourage people to buy it and support cool people talking about cool ideas like you, Shawn.
And if you buy this book, you'll be supporting 4 children in Ottawa. So, I stole that line off of a Nova Scotia folk singer, Dave Gunning, who sold me a CD that way. He goes, yeah, if you buy the CD, you're supporting 2 poor children in Nova Scotia. I'm like, well, how can you not do that?
So I'd like to thank you. And you mentioned craft beer. And here in Kamloops, we actually have a craft beer festival. We have five great breweries for a town our size. That's pretty good. So if you're ever out this way, we'll have to treat you to some of that.
I will make the same offer back. And I actually meant in my notes to mention the fact that, the ebook is $4. So if anybody out there buys it and decides they hate it, if you ever come to Ottawa, look me up. I'll buy you coffee and pay you back. So thanks so much for your time. And again, I want to thank UJP and the Kamloops Society for the Written Arts. I want to thank Andre and Catherine at the Thompson-Nicola Regional Library, as well as Demi, who helped out with this evening. And I just want to thank anybody who's watching right now for not watching Netflix and watching something about the arts.
Yeah. Thank you, Shawn. Take good care. Good luck with the book, and we look forward to another book.
Great. Thanks so much.
Okay. Take care.